Okay, so there's a lot of political tension. It's an election year. It's a mess. You come from being viewed online as, and I don't want to like frame you as something maybe you didn't see yourself as, or you didn't, but almost like a leftist creator activist.
Yeah, before left book was even like coined as a term. I was speaking on stuff like Black Lives Matter.
Yes.
Trayvon Martin before they started becoming bumper stickers and stuff.
Yeah, and this is before it was in the mainstream. So this is pre-2020 when it all we started seeing 2016 kind of remnants of it, and then 2020 it really hit the fan after George Floyd. And so now we're in an election year. We're more politically divided than we've ever been. You used to identify like leftist / anarchist. Was that kind of like your political ideology? And this is pre-coming to Christ and having a radical transformation. Like his testimonies on our channel. It's on his channel. You guys can go check that out. But how would you say your political views have changed since coming to faith? Because you referenced Jordan Peterson, you're referencing a lot of like conservative heads now, but that's very different than what your views used to be. And so like what's changed and what stayed the same?
Well, I wouldn't say that my views are conservative or like Jordan. I just, when I left YouTube, I started to watch more stuff that I didn't agree with.
Okay.
But I kind of always was like that. Like a lot of times people would be like, you watch this person? I'm like, yeah, what? You think that I watch people that I agree with? That's kind of boring.
Yeah.
You know, I watch people that I disagree with.
Yeah. As do I. Like I watch like the Young Turks. I don't know if you know who FD Signifier is. He's like
FD Signifier.
Oh, bro, he's the only one that like really gets under my skin because there's just so many presuppositions about the world. I'm just like, oh, bro. Okay, but go ahead.
He's a good video essayist.
Though. He's a great video essayist. But then when he gets on his like hyper political, like destroy property values, not probably destroy property rights and like the real Marxist stuff, I just go, oh, bro, this is dark. You know,
I would say what changed. A lot has changed socially, of course, because a lot of all of that stuff crosses over. You have the socio-political, economic state of the world, as he said with Jaden Smith, right? So those are three things, right, that kind of formulate somebody's like view of the world.
Yeah.
To this day, I still haven't voted, and I still don't support anyone that is that is like running right now.
Yeah.
There's nothing that I see that glorifies God in any way, and that's my number one. Me, if it doesn't glorify God, then it doesn't deserve my attention. But then there's like liberties that God gives us, especially when it comes to like our finances and economics, to where there's a lot more leeway with stuff like that. You know, like Jesus didn't preach capitalism. He also didn't preach communism, despite what a lot of leftists like to say, like, oh, Jesus would have been a socialist and he fought for women's equality. I'm like, bro, God did not become, you know, man in the flesh to say, oh yeah, I'm going to fight for these political issues that y'all already. I would say what's changed a lot is the social aspects, like my views on the nuclear family. I was a relationship anarchist, you know, polyamorous, didn't believe in marriage, didn't care to have children. I didn't think it was important to have both a mother and a father in a home. Or have a two-parent household. I thought, like, you know, it takes a tribe anyway, so it doesn't matter if a child has two mothers and one father, or two fathers and one mother, or a whole polycule of people. So that's probably the most radical change socially.
Do you think that was because you were brought up in a nuclear family, your mom and dad together, loving Jesus, and you kind of took it for granted?
Yeah. Well, that probably did play a part in it.
Yeah,
that definitely had to play a part in it, especially as I started to meet more people who had parents that were divorced. And especially like, you know, my wife being one who grew up with parents that were divorced. So, you know, seeing the differences and how our lives played out and just the dynamics of the families and how that changes things, I'm like, there is something to that. Because yeah, I didn't grow up with the perfect family in the world, but you know, there were times that I wished my mom and dad did get a divorce because, you know, they were in conflict. But then later on, I'm like, I'm glad they stuck it out.
Yeah, glad they
because
fought.
that taught me that things can be worked out, that there is such a thing as forgiveness and restoration and reconciliation.
That's good.
Whereas that is very hard for people to think of if they have divorced parents. Now you have to kind of get over that hurdle of, if my parents didn't work it out, am I going to be able to work it out? Right? Like, is it going to be like another continuation of the cycle?
Yeah.
Whereas I took for granted that I had that example to this day, still together, despite everything that happened. You know, marriage isn't easy. Things happen.
Yeah. Yeah. No, that's good. I think there are aspects that, as someone who didn't have both of my parents, even before I was a Christian, I knew that like, oh, like I'm not going to repeat the cycle. You know what I mean? Like I know, like I wanted my wife in the home. I wanted to be around my kids. I wanted to be in the same household as them. And I'm not saying those of you guys that are like in blended families or anything like that. Like you failed and it's beyond. That's not what I'm saying. God uses those situations too. But for me, I knew for a fact that like I wanted to have what I didn't have for my kids and my wife and my family. And so it's interesting to hear you say that as someone that was in a family, though it wasn't perfect, right? So in that, your social views changed a lot. You believe in a nuclear family, and then you
have the economic and the political part,
the economic political part,
which those things are even more heavily intertwined because you have stuff like Marxism, which is both political and economic. I still would be considered, I guess you could say, an anarcho-syndicalist, where I believe in workers' rights. I believe, like, I have a lot of faith in companies being able to work mutualistically. I don't know if you ever heard of mutualism, or like companies that are, have not only co-founders but co-owners, where the workers also have a piece of that pie, and they have the incentive to work on it because there's ownership. They actually own a piece of that, rather than, oh yeah, I'm just making the same wage no matter what. There's this capitalist idea of, oh, well, there's no incentive to work if everyone owns it. It's like, well, it's kind of the opposite. And it's not just, oh, there's only capitalism and there's only communism, right? Like, because if we're all making 15, why am I going to come the next day to work for the same 15? I'm going to do better. Oh, I'm going to work harder than everyone else for the chance at a promotion for like $2 extra. I still have no real ownership.
Yeah, no, it's interesting. I think, so here's what I think. I think a lot of people, unfortunately, in our society conflate capitalism with corporatism.
Right.
Like corporatism is like massive businesses too big to fail, the Amazons, the Walmarts, right? And in a capitalistic society, and I'm with you, I'm not saying like Jesus was like pro-capitalism, but there's principles of capitalism like the investing, the right to own property, and the right to own the capital, which creates the outcome, right? I think all those things are presupposed in the scriptures, meaning like how many parables are there about plowing the land and right, farming metaphors over and over. So I think there's certain things that presuppose capitalism, but I think where a lot of people make valid arguments is that they have an issue with corporatism or crony capitalism, right? Where it's like these monopolistic ventures that just grow so big, and then the people at the bottom are like, I don't want to say exploited, but to an extent exploited, and there's no upward mobility and there is no ownership. Whereas the folks that I know that run small businesses end up doing what you just described, right? They give the people incentive, whether that's through bonus structures or percentages of the businesses or whatever, right? And so I think maybe the issue isn't capitalism. Maybe the issue is the downstream effects of deregulation to allow monopolies to flourish. And then when the monopolies flourish, guess what you got? You got a bunch of Walmarts, Amazons, huge companies that you don't own the shares of. You know what I mean? And I think in terms of the shares, I think it is interesting that we are in a society where you can own a Tesla share. Like that's pretty fire. You know what I mean? Like, and I remember when I was in high school, I understood stocks and mutual funds, and I remember trying to buy and get into a mutual fund, and it was so hard. You got to have $2,000 cash, and you have to go find a financial planner.
Now you go on Cash App.
Now you go on Cash App, and you could buy Tesla shares right now. Like that's pretty incredible how much the economics of even investing have changed. Where now, at least in our society, anyone, and I'm being literal, I would say anyone, even poor people struggle, can own assets of an appreciating value. And that's not forever. That's recent. That's within the last, 5 years? We've just gotten Robinhood, Cash App, right? Like these are all relatively modern things. Now, obviously, you got to be able to have the cash flow to save and put into those assets, right, consistently. But I think that's very unique. And my advice would be, like, when you're talking about what you're talking about, I think that's a fair critique. My heart would be like, okay, cool. Is it possible to work with small business owners that are more fair with their employees?
Oh yeah, definitely.
You know what I mean?
Because even like when you think of anarcho-syndicalism, or like just anarchy in general. It's just like I had discussed with you earlier. It's like it's not about just hierarchy in general, because there's justified hierarchy and there's unjustified hierarchy.
Yeah, give me an example of justified versus unjustified hierarchy.
A justified hierarchy would be like a leader, right? Like Moses was the leader. He was, he was the leader. It wasn't unjustified. The people counted on him to get certain things done. But Moses wasn't like, okay, all of the manna is falling out of the sky and I'm taking most of it because I'm the leader. And now you each get one piece, but I'm going to have more just because I'm the leader. I'm the leader in terms of I'm calling the shots, and you guys, it's a mutual, like it's a trusting thing.
Yep.
Right? It's like even in a family, you have a husband and a wife. Sure, he's the head of the family. He's leading, and the wife and the children, they're all willfully submitting to your will.
Yep.
But at the same time, you're not like, oh, I'm the one that's busting my behind at work, so I'm going to take most of this money and I'm going to give y'all some crumbs.
Okay.
You get me? Like, I'm going to take $1,000 allowance and the rest of y'all get 10.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay.
So that's what you have is like, it's kind of a systemic failure to where capitalism, it has to be, you can't just have straight up capitalism with no regulation, right?
Sure.
Like people are going to abuse that power the more. Like when you're at small business level, like you said, you don't really see those imbalances. It's as the wealth starts to exponentially accrue.
It's when Boeing gets deregulated.
And then
you're like,
get
whistleblowers. Yeah,
right.
yeah.
So that there's just certain things. It's just like, and God is a God of balance. He has certain way, even servants. There was a certain way that you were to treat servants. You couldn't just do whatever you wanted.
That's right.
You couldn't just abuse people just because, so in that same sense, you can have markets even within socialism. Like that's what I'm saying. Like people always think like, oh, all of leftism is no market. Just the state controls the entire market, but that's not necessarily true.
Not in Scandinavian nations. They have a balance of high safety nets, to your point, with still a high competition in capitalism. Like Sweden specifically, I think capitalism may have been like really streamlined from Sweden initially, and now people may not see Sweden like a capitalistic nation, but it's very capitalistic, right? There's still massive innovation, massive tech happening there. I think the issue though with those nations is then does everybody want to pay more in taxes, right? And that's where we get into like what is fair, what isn't fair. You have, I want to say the average rate in Sweden is around 45%. And everybody's paying more, right? Versus here, you have the top 10% paying in 75% of the taxes, and then you have the bottom 90% paying 20. You know what I mean? Like, so then it's like, well, how much more can you just quote unquote tax the rich before wealth flight happens? Because wealth flight's a real thing, right? People would just leave. I mean, look how many people left California for Florida, and then you get to those states, and then they'll go to Puerto Rico. Let's just flat out, or they'll go to Monaco. Let's just go to flat out tax havens. So that's the dangerous part about like overtaxing. Overtaxing people.
You start to decentivize doing well. Because I'm like, all right, if I'm going to get taxed more for doing well, maybe I just shouldn't do well.
No, for real, for real. I mean, really, I know people that have intentionally not claimed money on their taxes that they earn from tips because they don't. They know that they would lose certain assistance or certain programs, and that to your point, that or they'll just pay more in taxes, and then you just go, well, that doesn't really. And then to get real estate, you got to earn more, you got to claim more, right? And like I remember as an entrepreneur, like here's a practical example where the temptation was real for me. We do shows, we'd have show money. Show money was cash, and so it's like if you making $2,000-3,000 a night off of selling T-shirts and CDs or whatever. This is 10 years ago CDs. You may be tempted to not claim that because you don't want to pay taxes on that. And so I think that's the rub with like overtaxation, which 115 years ago, we didn't have federal income. Like taxes were like 3%. You know what I mean? And now it's like in California, bro, you could be paying up to 62% in taxes. New York and California.
That's wild.
Yeah. And so it's like, how do you find that balance in terms of creating economic mobility for people that really want it? And how many people want it? How many people are just hanging on by a thread and don't have the capacity to do anything else? How many people have the opportunity and have the capacity, but they're distracted with chasing pleasure, perpetually pleasure chasing? Like, this is where it gets super, super complicated because people are complicated creatures. Like some people are legitimately like that single mother who perhaps was married and her husband died and now she's a widow and she literally just can work and take care of her kids. she's not going to have the economic mobility to be like, I'm going to go learn coding and learn how to video edit so I could, like that's not realistic. But the person that's like 18, 19 who is perhaps growing up in a neighborhood like you did may not have the imagination and the access to go, I'm going to learn video editing so I can go work for another creator so I can then learn to be a better creator so then I could, you know what I mean? And so it's like there's real obstacles that people are dealing with. How do you think is a reasonable way to stir hope in people, right? Because I think our end prescriptions will be the same, regardless on if you're talking about anarchists, which I'm not fully tracking all the way what that means yet, or I'm talking capitalism. I think the prescriptions will be the same for people to hopefully change their situation for the better.
I think it ultimately, we have to center it back to Christ. Like, how would Christ behave? Like, even in that moment that you had, okay, you have all this money, you can take it for yourself, or you can realize, you know what? I care about my fellow man. And I know that the taxes I pay and everybody else pays, I'm taking advantage of a lot of public goods that we have, right? Like, markets are great. Markets are great for creating value, especially in a very short period of time. And, booming business. But you have certain things that it's like, do you want someone to be able to hoard water resources? Do you want someone to be able to hoard railroads? Like certain things that need to be publicly owned, which we pay taxes for, rather than someone kind of just have a monopoly on that thing. Because those things are very easily monopolized. How many railroads can you make? You know, right?
Yeah.
How many lakes can you have? I mean, there's certain things that they're not really created, right? There's certain resources that are natural resources or things that, going back to the idea of human rights. What's a human right? Like, do we have a right to be able to go and fetch some water from a lake, right? Is that our God-given right, or is it not? Like, so that's something that people contend with. Like, people say, like, medical care is a right. That's something that's controversial. And then when you talk about Medicare, you get into even heavier conversations of like, oh, well, what if someone wants gender affirming surgery? Is that medical care? Then are they entitled to that?
What if somebody wants
are they entitled to that?
Right.
So you start to get into conversations like that. It's a fundamental issue of what's a human right, what's like the dignity of a person. And I think as Christians, we have to think of what's dignified regardless of whatever economic system we're in. Like, yeah, I can have my values of anarchism where I believe it should be a rotating state and rotating ownership of certain things so that all of the power doesn't just flow into one person's hands. And, you have industries that are, collectively owned, but they're able to still trade and create and compete with other, industry stuff like that. But where there's not just like a CEO that's making 140 times more than,
I never understood. I never understood that. Like, I never understood. Listen, I think if people derive certain value in a marketplace, they should be compensated fairly. I think in that though, I never understood why would a CEO want such a disparity between their employees and them? Like I don't think that's a good look.
I wouldn't feel right. Like me as a Christian, I would not feel right. And even before I was like in my walk with Christ, but even more so now, I don't know how I would feel to be like the head of a fast food company and I'm like literally a billionaire and my lowest employee like is living paycheck to paycheck, like, and has to be on food stamps. But at the same time, I think the other side of the argument, that's the reason why a lot of these billionaires are okay with that, because they know, well, the government's going to step in and give them some food stamps anyway.
Yeah. Well,
you have that safety net, which makes them makes things seem less cruel than they are.
Yeah. So the safety net is an interesting thing because I think you don't qualify for many programs unless you make less than $19,000 a year. I think that's the number that I just looked at on a Johnny Harris video. I think the thing about taxes that I think is a fair, this is my critique, is like, I don't think the government is efficient at almost anything. Like, I think they're actually inefficient at most things. So the thing is that it's not that obviously there's roads and there's infrastructure and like
stuff that has to get done.
Yes. Well, when you're talking about the military industrial complex, when you're $500 to swap out a toilet seat, like these are real things that people in that world have talked about. When you're talking about the DMV, when you're talking about like most government subsidized things or controlled things aren't very efficient. They're actually very inefficient. And so then it comes down to, okay, so I don't know that I trust the government to do much of anything because it's so, and they keep going in debt every year, $32 trillion in debt across Republicans and Democrats, right? So they can't keep a budget like me, that wouldn't work for me or you, right? Like we have like what we comes in gets spent. We don't get to go in debt every month, right? Like that's not how anyone's checkbook works. Our government's going crazy with debt, and so which is a whole like fiscal modern monetary policy nonsense.
To add a little bit to what you just said, it's funny. We used to have a term back in my leftist days that America is capitalism for the poor, but communism for the rich, because they're always getting bought out. They're always getting like
bailed out. Yeah, banks get bailed out, and I think that's wrong.
So it's communism. It's like it's a welfare state for them.
Yeah, I think that's wrong, and I don't think rich people should be bailed out. I also don't think rich people should be taxed at exorbitant amounts, because this is what then it creates. It creates the loophole. So the loophole is, so when we're talking about the CEO making billions and the employees make, the CEO makes billions not because that's what he is on his W-2s. Right. Tim Cook is, I think his salary is $2 million.
Yeah, some people don't even take a salary at all. They're just making plenty with the shares that they have in the company.
And those shares are taxed different.
Yep.
So then they're taking the shares. The shares is what actually makes up their net worth.
And as long as they didn't sell any.
And they don't sell any, and then what they do, and even if they sell some, then you're getting taxed different on those. But the real joke is, I'm just gonna borrow against my assets.
Right.
And pay nothing.
Yep.
So Tim Cook has $100 billion in I'm throwing out numbers in Apple stock, and he makes $2 million on paper, but then he just borrows against a couple billion of that and lives $1 billion lifestyle. Like that's whack. Like that's kind of trash.
Yeah.
But that's what happens when you have these tax policies that are progressing in the rates. Hey, thank you so much for checking out the video. Comment down below and let me know what you think. And be sure to check out this video that YouTube is recommending just for you. Let me know if they nailed it. All right? I'll see you over there. Peace.